Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Elizabeth Laird, to our Education Corner podcast. And we're very keen to hear all about your very exciting life and the many books that you've written. And we definitely have lots of children that are great fans of your writing. Who are going to be thrilled to hear you talk a little bit about it. You obviously write books that are often very realistic. They tend to explore very contemporary events, such as war, homelessness, and also the experience of refugees. And you've had a very exciting life living and working in Malaysia, Ethiopia, India, Iraq, Lebanon, and Austria. How do you feel that this has impacted your writing?
Well, I mean, it's been completely seminal to my writing. I suppose the first novel I wrote set in a foreign country was Kiss the Dust, which was set in Iraq after we'd visited Iraqi Kurdistan in the 1970s, actually, although I didn't write the book till the late 80s, when I watched Kurdish people being returned to their villages after Saddam Hussein had taken them to concentration camps. And, you know, that was very moving. And then coming back to London, I interviewed Iraqi refugees to get their stories. And I always feel with books like that, I'm bearing witness to some of the great stories of our time.
And during the 1990s, you travelled around Ethiopia collecting folk stories from traditional storytellers, and the British Council actually produced them in a series of readers for Ethiopian schools. And then a selection of wider audience was published When the World Began, stories collected in Ethiopia. Could you tell us a little bit more about these books?
Yeah. Well, yes, I lived in Ethiopia. I taught there back in the 1960s and loved the country and travelled very widely. And then I had to leave rather suddenly. I was arrested on a murder charge, which was unfortunate. I hadn't done it, I assure you, but I had to leave the country and I didn't really dare go back for 30 years. And when I did go, I was entranced all over again. And I met the director of the British Council in Addis Ababa and suggested to him that it would be great to collect stories and produce readers. And he enthusiastically took me up on this and provided translators and transport. And I went back 5 times and did 5 month-long journeys to the farthest corners of Ethiopia, collecting stories from farmers, prisoners in a prison, even in Gondar, herdsmen in the desert areas. Absolutely incredible journeys. And I collected these wonderful folk stories. Actually, I have written a book about those journeys, but one for grown-ups. It's called The Lure of the Honeybird. What was so exciting to me was to discover how these stories, which I might be sitting in a village in the middle of nowhere, you know, really, and somebody would be telling me a story. I could talk about this forever, but I won't, I promise you. And it would start about people who'd thrown leaves into a lake to stun the fish so they could catch them. And the water parted to the left and the right. And they walked in through a channel. And I thought, where have I had this before? Hold on a minute, Moses in the Red Sea. And there were these resonances all the time with the Bible, Quran, the Panchatantra, Aesop's fables. And I realized that the stories I was collecting in Ethiopia were extremely ancient and fascinating. And that's partly what I've discussed in The Lure of the Honeybird. But I mean, I've always been fascinated by folk stories, but honestly, that was just the most incredible project for me.
And a real honour to hear it direct from the local people as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, and many of them, they didn't really tremendously value the stories because they just thought it was old granny, you know, down the back of and they wanted to watch television and listen to the radio. So the stories were beginning to disappear. So I felt rather like the Brothers Grimm. I was catching them before they were lost for good.
How wonderful. You've written many books and I'm not going to list all of them. And I know that they're very popular with a lot of the families and the children that we have contact with. But some of them include Red Sky in the Morning, which was about a disabled child. You wrote Jay, which has a slight drug theme, or Jake's Tower, where he's dealing with a violent stepfather. And I'm sure that children take confidence, and children that are perhaps in difficult situations can read your books and feel that they're not so alone. Were these stories based on events that you experienced and witnessed, or what led you to writing about them?
Yeah, well, they are always, I think. And I think that's always true of writers. Even if they're writing fantasy, stuff comes out of their own lives. I mean, Red Sky in the Morning was about my little brother who had a very great disability. And, you know, the others came from experiences that my children had. But the ones that I wrote abroad, like The Garbage King, which is set in Ethiopia, I got to know a gang of street boys in Addis Ababa, partly through the folk stories, actually, because I was asked to go and work with a gang of street kids. And they told me their own stories. It took days. They poured out their own stories. And I put them together in The Garbage King. And then Oranges in No Man's Land. My husband and I lived in Beirut during the Civil War. In our first flat, there were bullet holes all the way along the wardrobe where, somebody outside had, and we were on the Green Line, which was the dividing line between the armies. I didn't stay there very long. And I wrote Oranges in No Man's Land, which really came out of that experience. I would stand on my balcony every day and look down and watch what was happening and then take cover when necessary and, go through the checkpoints and my baby in a pushchair and the soldiers would take him out and play with him. And so that's that story. And Welcome to Nowhere is more recent. I went to Jordan to work in Syrian refugee camps to teach English, to teach about storytelling to teachers. And I talked to many, many people and they told me their stories. So whenever I write something that's not about a white person living in Britain, then I have to do meticulous research because, of course, who do I think I am? Taking on the voice of a street boy in Ethiopia or a Palestinian kid or a child from Syria. I'm walking on thin ice and I know that. So I don't take that job very lightly. I really do research. I talk to lots and lots of people. I read things, I listen, I wait. And sometimes I work with an author from that culture.
That's fantastic. And reading about you, your love of travelling has obviously been a theme throughout your life, hasn't it?
Getting a bit old now for that.
Edinburgh. Edinburgh being the best place to go. How do you think that the books that you've written have impacted children? Do children come back to you or write to you?
Yeah, they do a bit. I mean, I wish I knew, actually. I can't say. I do think, actually, here it is. I do think that it's important what children read. And some people say it doesn't matter what children read as long as they're reading. Well, up to a point. But you don't say it doesn't matter what children eat as long as they're eating. You don't just give them chocolate. So I think it's great that children are reading funny books and silly books, and that's fine. Let them do that. That's great. But I think that when children get gripped by a story and they cry and they feel it, and a child once wrote to me after she'd read Red Sky in the Morning, she said, "I want to spend my life doing something good," she wrote. Well, I thought, well, I hope she has done. That was 20 years ago. She's grown up now. But I think what children read as children can really make a difference to their empathy. So I don't know about me, because when I was a kid in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, I'm going to be 80 next year, honestly, what was there? Little Women, Heidi, Narnia.
Oh, it was so different.
Written. There's almost nothing. I mean,
there was no audiobooks, there was no Kindle.
No YA, no Kindle, no cartoon books.
No online.
No Roald, nothing really.
I'm a little bit younger, but nonetheless, I remember just reading anything I could lay my hands on.
Me too. Yes, exactly. Read Victorian weepies, but children barefoot in the snow who see angels. I mean, honestly, it just wasn't the same. So I do think what children read does have an impact on them. And actually, I think it's quite important that they read books which stimulate their imagination and encourage empathy.
And grappling with real events, really.
Yes, and some good fantasy does that, actually. Good fantasy that's not just all about the next thrill and the most exciting bit, but that makes you think about communities and how they interact.
I wanted to ask you about A Little Piece of Ground. You wrote it, I think, in 2003.
Yes.
It's set in Ramallah in Palestine from the point of view of a little boy caught up in the Intifada. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about the message you wanted to share in this book?
Well, I went to Gaza and Ramallah to run courses for Palestinian teachers who wanted to write for children. And, quite honestly, Chloe, I was profoundly shocked by the situation there. I was very shocked. And there were tanks on the edges of the streets. Children were traumatized. And I think that the truth is that any military occupation, it could be anywhere in the world where there's a military occupation, has a devastating effect on those people who are occupied. But it's also deeply corrupting to the occupiers. Nobody benefits. And it's gone on now for a very, very long time. I didn't really have a message. I just wanted to write about what it was like. And I collaborated with a Palestinian writer called Sonia Nimmer, a very talented storyteller. And I went back to stay with her for a while, and we made up the plot together, and I went to all the places I wanted to describe in the book. It, of course, offended some people, because most Jewish people very much want Israel to be there for obvious reasons, and they want Israel to be above reproach. And they find it deeply painful when they feel that Israel is not beyond reproach. And the Palestinians aren't beyond reproach either. But there is a story there that I wanted to tell. Again, I think it's something to do with bearing witness, really. There are these great world events that are happening all around us. Let's go and have a look and see what's really going on.
And perhaps tell some of the hardships that people are experiencing. Crusade in 2007 was shortlisted for the Costa Children's Book Award.
Yes.
The Fastest Boy in the World in 2014 was shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal. How did this make you feel? These are great achievements.
Oh, it's fantastic being shortlisted for awards. I mean, we don't have a career structure when we're writers, you know. You don't get promoted. But every now and then, if you're really lucky, you get an award, and it has the same effect. You don't get any more money, but you do feel very boosted. No, it's wonderful.
More recently, you've written about environmental issues. You wrote Song of the Dolphin Boy in 2018, which is about the impact on dolphins from plastic rubbish on the ocean off the coast of Scotland. This is obviously a very timely and topical issue. How do you think it's helped perhaps teachers, children to address issues related to pollution and the broader issues we now face? And obviously it's an ongoing point of discussion regarding climate change and the different issues that we're facing.
Well, I mean, it's the big thing, isn't it? I mean, it's the big, big, big elephant in the room. And we've all got to think about it. But I think when it comes to children, it's terribly important that you give them a chance to think, oh, I could do that. That's something I could do. I could object to a balloon release where, you know, balloons routinely land in the sea and strangle the dolphins and so on, and eaten by whales and then they starve. And, you know, that's something children... So like Greta Thunberg, apparently she was a very difficult child, but once she discovered that it was something she could do, she became a very much more cheerful person. And although children are very depressed about the climate, worryingly so, actually, I think that the story gives an idea of children who actually take action in a nice way.
You and your husband, David McDowell, now divide your time between London and Edinburgh, which we were discussing earlier. Do you share your ideas and bounce off each other with your writing inspiration?
Up to a point. I mean, my latest novel, which is coming out in July, it's called The Misunderstandings of Charity Brown. And it's about my childhood. And David, of course, is nearly we're the same age. And together we grew up in the 1950s. And it was very nice being able to talk through with him that childhood experience. The novel is really about my very religious childhood. I was brought up in a very small religious sect. And he was also. I think the thing about that is actually on a broader level is that a lot of people feel when you're talking about a small religious sect is that the only answer is violent rebellion and rush out and, you know, change and do that. That didn't happen to me or my husband. We both gently moved into a more liberal, very liberal view of the world. But I would like children looking at this book, perhaps, to think any child from any religious background, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, who has a disconnect between home and school, and we know that's a very common thing, that a child can read the book and think, well, I am allowed to ask questions and I am allowed to explore. And I do have to negotiate this difficult problem of how I mix my home life or don't mix my home life and my school life. And it's a sort of hope that, you know, there's a sort of child able to mesh these two parts themselves more coherently. That's what I've been trying to do in that novel. And David has been a great help to me in that as well, actually. Although I can't help him because he's the world expert on the Kurds and Kurdish history. And do I know anything about that? No, I don't.
But you can be a good listener.
I can be a good listener. Yes.
My final question is, many children love your books, and I'm sure reading your books enables them to learn about events that are happening all around the world. I'm sure that at some point you'll probably be exploring what's happening in the Ukraine. But what advice would you give to a child who perhaps is inspired and would like to go on to write their own books?
Okay, I've got 3 pieces of advice. This is what I always say when I speak to children. So, some people may have heard me say this before. Number 1 is read. Just read everything you can possibly read. If you only like non-fiction, read fiction and vice versa. Just keep reading and reading and reading. The reading child becomes the writing child. Second one is write. I started writing a diary when I was about 12. I still write every day. It's like an artist with a sketchbook. You have to keep practicing, you have to keep your hand in. So just write stories, write anything you can think of. But the third one is the most important one, actually. And that is, it sounds silly, but it's just live, do things. Don't get on your phone all the time. Don't sit on computers, Instagram, social media. This is not life experience. It's not really life experience. And if you want to write, you've got to experience life. You have to allow yourself to explore your feelings in a good way. And you can't tell children not to be safe, but children can be encouraged to get outside and meet other kids, do sport, join clubs, have hobbies, that old-fashioned word, get off their phones and live, experience real things. Sometimes, be in a field and there's a bull and you have to run away from it. That's when children, they'll have an experience and they'll want to write it down. So those are my 3 tips. Read, write and live.
How wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. And we very much look forward to when Misunderstandings of Charity Brown is released. When is it due out?
6th of July.
6th of July. We will remember that date.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clary.